we're going to talk a bit about sort of the difference between American and UK media, the sort of balance between alternative media and mainstream media. I thought I'd just sort of introduce myself a little bit and then ask you to introduce yourself in case there's people on our channel who aren't familiar with you. So my background, I worked for Channel 4 News for many years in the UK and then the BBC, and then made documentaries for several years. So I've worked in a newsroom in the mainstream media, so what you'd probably call the liberal mainstream media, and also for the last year and a half or so I've been sort of delving more deeply into YouTube after setting up Rebel Wisdom, the YouTube channel. So I've kind of had a bit of a steep learning curve in terms of seeing the difference between the two, but it's been a really interesting journey and sort of producing documentaries and films on YouTube. Can you tell me a bit about your background and what maybe a little bit of what you've learned doing it over the last however many years?
Sure. So now I host the David Pakman Show, which is a multi-platform, independent, progressive show based in the U.S. Multi-platform meaning that the program is on radio stations, it's on television stations, it's on satellite TV on a channel called Free Speech TV, and then independently we also have an online presence with a YouTube channel and an audio podcast. And in terms of how it's changed, I mean, of course, on the technical side, it's changed, and I hope for the better as my production team has expanded and gotten more tech savvy, and technology has continued to improve and become more accessible. But I think from a sort of perspective point of view, at the beginning, I would tend to do much more of the on the one hand, on the other hand sort of presentations. And I realized that was both not particularly interesting to me, that I really wanted to be giving my opinion, my point of view. And it also wasn't super interesting to the audience because it was, either way, there are going to be people who disagree, and I might as well just do the best job I can of advocating for what I sort of think is best or the best policy. So I think over time, the program has certainly become more opinionated than it started as.
I'd love to return to that a bit later on, because there is this sense that this kind of view from nowhere affectation that the mainstream media has been shown up quite a lot by the growth of alternative media as being an affectation. Like there is no view from nowhere, and I think that's becoming really much more clear. One of the reasons that I was really keen to talk to you, David, was I confess I wasn't that aware of your show until I started diving into my preparation for my interview with Dave Rubin, and I saw that. I think one of the things in the online media space at the moment is it's very easy to get caught in reality tunnels. It's very easy to end up giving your audience what you want. And I could see that at times you'd taken unpopular perspectives with your audience, and that you seemed willing to engage with people from all over the political spectrum, but from what I could see, from a very good faith perspective, and being willing to say things that might make you unpopular. Could you tell me about some of those occasions that have happened on your channel, and why has that happened, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think certainly everything I say is unpopular with someone. I think maybe what you're getting at is sometimes there have been stories where there was more of a backlash from what I guess I would perceive to be maybe my core progressive audience, to generally well to the left of someone like Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, but still probably to the right of actual socialists and communists, so to speak. So somewhere in there in the sort of world of social democracy. And my principle has been, going back to the first thing we talked about in kind of explaining to you the philosophy of my show and how I've gotten away from this idea of on the one hand, on the other hand, the view from nowhere, and just really doing every story the way I see it. I recognize that you're never going to see eye to eye on every issue with any particular person. I mean, with people that I consider to be my strongest political allies, there still can be areas of disagreement, and there almost always are. So the approach that I've taken to just do every story the way I see it, regardless of the consequences, is based in, I just want to be genuine, right? And if I start moderating, and by moderating, I don't mean moving to the middle, but I mean being a moderator of my own speech on the basis of what I think the audience reaction will be, it's actually potentially a slippery slope I don't want to get into. And I'm always cautious of slippery slopes when I don't think they apply, but that actually could be a slippery slope I don't want to get into. So, for example, there was a recent story in the United States about a congresswoman named Ilhan Omar, where she made some comments related to the Israel lobby, and there were a number of perspectives on what she said, ranging from it was downright evidence of her personal anti-Semitism, all the way to the other side of it was a perfect analysis that was in no way tinged with anti-Semitism. And I took what I knew would be a position that some in my audience would disagree with or take issue with, but I decided to take it anyway. You know, if I looked at my YouTube analytics, I probably had a net loss of subscribers as a result of doing that story, and that's okay. And I think that my perception is that most of the audience that is supporting me financially is supporting me not because they expect that they're going to agree with me on every issue, but because they can trust that I'm going to be genuine with them about every issue and not calculate my perspective on the basis of what I think will be appealing to the people that are watching me, if that makes sense.
We're in a media environment that really doesn't reward nuance, it seems.
Absolutely. And on all of these issues, very often the most controversial issues where maybe my audience and I have clashed, my core audience, as I would call them, are issues where if you ignore the nuance that I'm at least attempting to present, and sort of make a caricature of my position, you really are completely missing the point that I'm making. So another example would be Venezuela. Venezuela has been one that I'm particularly interested in as an immigrant from Argentina to the United States and someone who sort of grew up in a house where Latin American, South American politics were a topic of significant discussion. I have made every attempt to sort of make very clear whenever Venezuela comes up and the Maduro-Chavez regimes come up, to make very clear that I'm against American intervention in Venezuela. I'm against, military involvement by the United States in Venezuela. That historically American involvement in that region of the world has been disastrous for the region, for the people of the region, but that as a non-authoritarian leftist, I am not a supporter of Chavez. I was not a supporter of Chavez. I am not a supporter of Maduro. And unfortunately, the reaction from many of those in my core audience is, David, how dare you support the United States putting a puppet president in Venezuela, which of course is not an argument that I'm making. So, and that's not even particularly nuanced, right? I mean, from my point of view, it's I don't like the regime, and I don't think it should be the United States that gets involved in replacing it. To me, it's barely nuance. But unfortunately, in an environment that doesn't seem to take super kindly to the on the one hand, on the other hand sort of thing, I've definitely suffered as a result of taking those positions.
I'm really interested in reflecting on a few recent media encounters that showed up sort of some of the culture clash between alternative and mainstream, and also UK and US. Maybe starting with the sort of very high profile clash between Andrew Neil on the BBC and Ben Shapiro.
Why don't you just say that you're on the left? Is this so hard for you? Why can't you just be honest?
Mr.
Seriously,
Shapiro,
it's a serious question.
Mr. Shapiro, if you only knew how ridiculous that statement is, you wouldn't have said it. So let's move on.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so is there a particular? Do you want to get my general sense of it, so to speak?
Yeah. Why don't you sketch out what you made of it from there? I mean, how familiar with the UK? Because it seemed that Ben Shapiro in particular wasn't very familiar with UK journalistic styles, which is very combative, very sort of devil's advocate questioning, and he seemed to completely misunderstand. And quite amusingly for a British watcher, because Andrew Neil is famously right-wing, he accused Andrew Neil of being clearly a left-wing interviewer.
Yeah, I thought that there were, my analysis, I maybe am more familiar with that style than at least Ben Shapiro appeared to be during that particular interview, although my familiarity with Andrew Neil was limited, although I was generally aware of him as a conservative individual personally. So I wasn't so surprised by the interviewing style. My surprise was really, maybe as you're hinting at the way that Ben Shapiro handled it, who within the context of the United States, and often in particular during these events that he does at colleges and universities where he's being questioned primarily by college students effectively, there's this idea that he's never rattled and that his mind operates so quickly and that you can't trick him in any way, and that he's always one step ahead and ready with the sort of most powerful, brutal refutations, as many YouTube clip titles like to point out. So I was most surprised by the way that he was so thrown off by the way the interview was going. And then it got very quickly to where, two principles that Ben Shapiro espouses almost to a level of satire in the United States are this idea of facts don't care about your feelings, and also being very much against so-called identity politics as defined in a sort of very particular way. And where it kind of broke down was that Ben violated both of those ideas, right? His incorrect perception of the identity of the interviewer caused him to sort of cut it short on the basis that this progressive left wing, whatever term you want to apply to the interviewer, was not interviewing him in good faith, or was employing some kind of gotcha questions, or however you want to analyze it. One of his principles in the context of how he's known in the US is that identity is not relevant in situations like this, that it's all about what are the facts. And in a sense, his feelings sort of got the best of him. His feelings overrode the facts, which were the questions posed to him by the interviewer, and the reality that the interviewer was actually conservative personally, not on the left. So that was what was so interesting to me, that someone who is known in the US as being sort of unshakably principled in identity doesn't matter, it's all about the facts, it's all about reality, abandoned that as he was very rattled by the way that the interview was carried out.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good time to mention Dave Rubin. So I interviewed Dave Rubin a bit over a month ago now, and put the interview out probably 2 weeks ago, something like that. And I first found out about the intellectual dark web through Dave Rubin's show, and so I was sort of very, I guess I admired a lot of the conversations that I'd seen on the show, and I hadn't paid a huge close attention to the other interviews that he'd done. And then in the research for the interview that I did with Dave, I dug up quite a bit of stuff that gave me a few concerns, and I knew that going in, for my own sort of self-respect as a journalist, I had to ask some more probing questions. The criticisms that I've seen of you that I think have some validity is sometimes you draw this, you talk about a new centre evolving, but you draw that new centre around some people that I would consider on the right, like Stefan Molyneux, for example.
Well, I've never said that Stefan Molyneux's in the new centre.
Really?
Have you ever heard me say that?
I thought you had.
No, I've never said that. No.
Yeah. Another example would be the Katie Hopkins interview.
Yeah.
And Katie Hopkins, I mean, I know Katie Hopkins pretty well, coming from the UK.
Yeah.
And the way that interview was framed was that she was sort of being shut down in a politically correct way. But the actual article that she wrote was calling for gunboats to be used against migrants and compared them to cockroaches.
Right. So the interview was about 2 years ago. I actually don't remember every specific instance of the interview. I mean, that's just the truth. I mean, this is one of the strange things. It's like everyone calls for more tolerance. We should talk to people. We should interview people. We should sit down with people. But then the second you actually do it, then you're the enemy.
I don't think I'd ever argue that you shouldn't sit down with
Yeah.
someone. I think my main point is whether people are being challenged enough.
Right. So as I said earlier, look, the bigger you get, the more relevant you get, the more haters are going to come out, but the more that legitimate criticism will come out too. And again, I address this all the time.
What do you think is the most legitimate criticism?
It's not really for me to say what the legitimate criticism of me. If someone wants to say that they don't like the way I interview or that I don't ask hard enough questions or something like that, well, I suppose that is a legitimate criticism of me. It's not the way I like doing my business. And, if you don't like what I'm doing, then I would say you don't have to watch. It doesn't mean I'm doing it perfectly.
I mean, one of the reasons I got in touch as well is that this has started happening more and more at Dave Rubin's events, that there are people who are asking him, why won't you talk to ContraPoints? Why won't you talk to Carl Kalinske? Why won't you talk to Sam Cedar? Why won't you talk to David Pakman? And I know recently as well that he said on stage that you'd lied about him, or he gave a reason why he wasn't going to be interviewed by you.
Or to interview me, I guess it was. Yeah, he said Pac-Man's lied about me. I think it was a bunch of times or many times or something like that. I still, if that's the case, then I really want to know what those lies, or, I would argue that they wouldn't really be lies. They might be misstatements, which I very well might have made about Dave Rubin. I just don't know what they are. I haven't heard so far. I mean, listen, my perspective is, so I'm not a journalist per se. Dave Rubin is not a journalist. We are doing programs that are commentary, interview, analysis, call it sort of what you want. So, my primary criticism of the way that Dave Rubin has carried out interviews are sort of, there's two criticisms. One is, I think that left-wing voices outside of the so-called intellectual dark web have been mostly excluded. Now, I know that recently there were assertions made that Dave has interviewed, I don't know if he said it was socialists and communists or lefties and communists or something like that. That may be true. I don't know who those folks are, and I'd be interested in knowing about that. But I think generally speaking, you don't have to give equal voice to all sides of the political spectrum. That's totally fine not to. But I think that if you are sort of asserting that there is a sort of open door policy to all sorts of ideas, then I think it would be best to more equally represent ideas from a variety of sort of placements on the political spectrum. So that's been one of my criticisms. And, I tentatively at one point was going to be appearing on Dave's new program, and then it didn't happen. And it's not completely clear to me exactly why. And I think at this point, I don't have the open invitation that at one point I did. So I would be glad to be one of those people, and I would be glad for others to be those folks. My particular interest in this is that I used to be relatively friendly with Dave, and we used to text and have phone calls with some sporadic regularity, I guess it would be the term I would apply to it. And since I interviewed him on my program for an hour, we've had almost no communication, and there's been what I perceive to be sort of like a cutting of what was at one point a very cordial and friendly relationship. And I don't know why that is. I don't know. He's never expressed that he wasn't happy with how the interview with me went, where I did go into policy in the way that I like to, healthcare, taxation, etc. So that's sort of my personal interest in it. As far as the one other thing I'll say is, as far as the interview style, yes, I've been critical of giving a platform. And that's the term I use, and I don't use it pejoratively. When you have a platform and you invite someone to it, you are sharing that platform with the other person. I take special care because of how I manage my show, where if I am platforming someone whose ideas I perceive to be extreme, dangerous, discriminatory, problematic, I make sure that I'm responsibly platforming them, which includes both being prepared to take on what I perceive to be bad arguments, and not being afraid to make clear that I disagree with some of those arguments or positions. I would like to see Dave do that. And as I've told him personally, he can kind of manage those interviews however he wants, but it's not how I would feel good about handling some of those interviews. Now, the reason maybe he doesn't feel comfortable being that adversarial, that would be perfectly fine. The reason may be that he agrees with those things that maybe I see as problematic positions, or some other reason. I don't know what the reason is, but it's not how I would sort of run my program. If there are critiques out there of Dave Rubin or whoever, which are limited to, this is a person who is doing something wrong because of the political orientation of their guests, period. That is guilt by association, and it's also just not really a serious critique. I think that my critique of the instances or the episodes of the Dave Rubin program that I have made focus on, number one, do I believe that there is irresponsible platforming taking place with regard to if there are known bad or incorrect ideas or ideas that are discriminatory, ideas that are xenophobic or whatever? Is the interviewer well enough prepared to push back against those? And whether or not, I mean, you could be prepared and still choose not to push back. I don't think that that is responsible platforming. I don't think that that serves any serious journalistic or cultural purpose. Most people who sort of exist in the West and have access to the internet and to media know that xenophobia exists, that white supremacy exists, that anti-Semitic conspiracies exist, so on and so forth. And I don't understand the value of merely giving someone a platform to espouse those ideas. So what I'm for is responsible platforming. I have interviewed all sorts of right-wing people with really disgusting views, but the only way that I feel good about it, about doing it, is if it's made abundantly clear that I disagree with these horrible ideas, and I'm prepared to push back against them. So to the extent that Dave Rubin has done interviews, for example, with folks like Brigitte Gabriel, where she actually touts anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and Dave doesn't push back against it, that's what my critique is of. It's not of the fact that he interviewed someone who's a right-winger. I completely agree. That's not really a good criticism. It's not a productive one. And it's not going to, I mean, listen, the left should engage with the right. The right, if it wants to, should engage with the left. But it needs to be done in a responsible way, and that's my approach to it.
Since the interview that I did with Dave Rubin, there have been quite a few pieces on various left-leaning channels about him, not just off because of my interview, although Sam Cedar did pick it up and run something on my interview. And I get a sense of almost like a feeding frenzy around him at the moment. And is that something that you're picking up?
I'm picking it up as well. I think it's gotten momentum, and I think that there has been sort of because of there's no better way to get something discussed on a bunch of YouTube channels than to mention the names of the hosts of those YouTube channels. So some of these people that have shown up at Dave's events and said, hey, what about David Pakman or Sam Cedar or ContraPoints? That's a great way to get that story onto those shows, for better or worse. But I do think, listen, what's going on with Dave Rubin is not uniquely bad. I think it's a combination of sort of an audience capture sort of dynamic combined with a predisposition from many of these internet enclaves to really adhere to the type of content that sort of is de facto produced on Dave's channel. And I think that there is a bit of a feeding frenzy going on. And I'm sort of trying to be careful not to devolve into the ad hominems, to restate that I think he and I could have a really great conversation, which I maintain my openness to participate in, and sort of leave it at that.
I also want to sort of take it out a little bit to say, so he's obviously been challenged quite a bit, and there's quite a lot of critiques of Dave out there already. And this seems to be a feature of the polarized landscape as well. I know, like Sam Cedar, for example, and I think Michael Brooks on Sam Cedar's show, there's quite a lot, and Anna Kasparian as well, there's quite a lot of critiques of Dave that, in a way, I can see that the audience of those shows wants people to beat up on Dave Rubin, so the tone of those critiques seems to become more and more combative, and then the chances for any kind of dialogue, or the chances of Dave sort of being able to say, well, yeah, I'll welcome these people onto my show, then seems to deteriorate massively because of the tone of those critiques. Do you see what I mean? Like that polarization seems to make good faith dialogue even more difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, why are some of these voices not being interviewed by Dave Rubin? But on the other hand, I completely see why he would not be inclined to bring voices on that are sort of levying harsher and harsher criticisms against him in terms of their tone as it goes sort of like above and beyond the facts. So that's why I have a track record that is not something to brag about. It's just a reality of being able to have civil conversation with almost anybody. Now, sometimes when I say that, people will write to me and say, David, it's no big accomplishment to be able to calmly talk to Nazis, right? And it's not, I'm not citing it as an accomplishment in that sense. I mention it in order to be able to say, although I have these differences with Dave Rubin or with whoever, with Ben Shapiro or name anybody, if we decide, hey, we're going to sit down and really figure out where do we agree, where do we disagree, what are the lines of this sort of this debate, assuming that it doesn't devolve into personal attacks against me, I'm going to have no problem carrying that out in a civil way where really the focus is going to be substance rather than attacks or tone or whatever. So I've tried to make it clear that these are my disagreements with Dave Rubin in terms of what he's putting out online, but I would sort of relish the opportunity to respectfully figure out where is he coming from on these things. You know, the last conversation I had with him, as I mentioned, was this hour interview I did with him. At this point, it might be 2 years ago or more. So I completely understand why, as people become more sort of virulent in their critiques, why he would be disinclined to allow them to participate on his program. That being said, I also am unsure why someone, for example, who is openly homophobic or anti-Semitic, which relates to two identities that Dave Rubin is part of, why they would be. I see platforming that without serious challenges just as problematic as sort of keeping out broad swaths of the political spectrum.
Yeah, there is something quite ironic, I find, in what's going on at the moment. And I'm bringing in sort of Ben Shapiro here as well in his criticisms of Andrew Neil. And that there is almost a mirror image of what they accuse the left or social justice warriors of doing, of tone policing, of no platforming, of pre-deciding that a conversation is not going to be constructive. And that feels very ironic. Like there is something very, there is something that's very similar about those two perspectives.
Yeah, and I'd love to have the opportunity to really explore that in some detail for sure. I mean, being against identity politics, but then making identity arguments, or being against sort of limiting the scope of voices or the ideas that are heard, but then not sort of actively pursuing more diversity of voices in those ways. And, I do think that without inviting me on anyone's program, I think that there would be a very interesting conversation to have with whether it's Dave or whether it's Ben Shapiro or whoever about what I perceive to be a contradiction as far as that goes. And I've made some video clips on my channel about those apparent contradictions. And I think it would be a great conversation to have. And it would not be a bad faith conversation. I mean, I genuinely am interested in, if someone says identity politics is bad, how do they justify making identity arguments? You know, I feel as though my view on identity politics is relatively nuanced, which is using identity as a sort of cudgel to suppress voices and to say only those who check a certain box should be listened to, or primarily should be the ones listened to. I'm against that. But it would also be ignorant to ignore the reality that one's identity relates to their experience in the world. And thus, there may be some special value or particular value in considering that when we are exploring what we should be doing as humans on this planet in terms of figuring out the problems that face us.
Are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work?
Very much so, yes. And I've interviewed him and recently read is it The Righteous Mind?
The Coddling of the American Mind is the most recent one. The Righteous Mind is about how good people are divided by politics.
That's the one I read, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think his work is absolutely crucial to understanding. If political belief is largely based on temperament, then we have to keep talking to each other, and the separation into armed camps, which is what seems to be happening through the kind of sense-making WMD of social media, seems to be one of the most existential threats that we're facing.
Absolutely. And privately, I've been talking to a lot of people about what are some techniques that have actually been able to sort of open the door to these cross-party lines conversations. And there, are some specific techniques that I've come across, which I think are useful, which I'm glad to talk about, but maybe are not really the scope of our conversation today. But I do believe that there are lots of ways that these conversations can happen. And I think it's undeniable that social media is not facilitating any of that.
I'd certainly be interested if you were able to run through them fairly quickly.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of ideas, and some of these I employ them on my program when I have adversarial callers. I mean, one thing is a great basis for a conversation between people who disagree is asking the other person to sort of read back to you or to explain to you what do they perceive your position to be, and maybe more importantly, why do they think you've arrived at that position? So, for example, healthcare debates can be extraordinarily divisive, just to take an issue like that. I am on the left, and I believe that some sort of single-payer, nationalized, or otherwise universal system is the way forward, although I'm relatively agnostic about the specifics. Rather than just like diving into a very heated conversation about that with someone who thinks the market system is best, if I ask them, listen, you know my position, why do you think I have my position? What led me to arrive at my position? If they are good faith participants, which will be very quickly exposed by a question like that, merely by reading back to me why they think I believe what I believe, they are going to be significantly predisposed to listen to my ideas because they are probably going to attribute good faith reasons to how I arrived at my conclusion. They might say, well, listen, you probably think it's the most efficient way to get the best care to the most number of people. If someone just says that, that is instantly changing the tone and the tenor of the conversation in a way that I think is very positive. I tend to follow that up with, given your position on this issue, what evidence, if I was able to present it to you, would change your mind? And this is something I first heard from Peter Boghossian, the defeasibility test, although I've seen it from others as well. Just those two questions to set up a conversation about most political issues will significantly include the chances of it being productive and maybe of actually making some progress on these issues.
It's interesting. So as I said, we've featured the intellectual dark web quite a lot. And there's some talk about what it is and whether there could be a kind of IDW protocol for good faith conversation. That I think could be part of it. I think steel manning is something that Eric Weinstein talks about, which is kind of what you're talking about in what you were just saying is, can you restate back to me my own argument in a way that I'll agree with?
I think that there's definitely significant overlap in the ideas, yeah.
From my perspective, sort of, I'm thinking about what is the other side of the culture war dynamic that we're looking at. And I think it is something like appreciating that everyone has values that are important. And Jonathan Haidt's work, I think, is really perfect for this, to show that there are 5 moral taste buds. Liberals are more sensitive to 2 of them, conservatives are more sensitive to the others. And that also that there's a sense that any set of values, when taken to an extreme, can become an ideology, and then in some sense you're divorced from an evolutionary conversation at that point, in that you can't really engage with anyone else because you've fixated your values into an ideology.
I think that's right. In the last year and a half or 2 years, one of the most valuable experiences I had when it comes to this is I actually went to rural northern Indiana in the Midwest of the United States, which is real Trump country. It's church country and it's gun country. I mean, it's basically a place where you drive down these country roads and the only things you pass are gun ranges and churches. And in spending some time there and in talking to people, I understand why they voted for Trump. I understand how abortion becomes this voting issue for large swaths of the country. I understand how guns sort of take on the cultural significance that they do for many people in the United States. It didn't change my views, but it definitely changed my perspective on, oh yeah, I actually understand how, if this is the environment you grow up around, you end up with the political views that seem totally antithetical to my sort of northeastern United States cosmopolitan views. And it was an extraordinarily enlightening experience, particularly in making me think about what are the best way. I still think that they're wrong on policy, but how can I better engage with them on those issues?
Great, David. Thank you very much for making the time.
My pleasure. It's so great to speak to you.